I think the Japanese are very eager to show that they're part of the general Western alliance. And their immediate concern is obviously more China and the threat from China. But since China and Russia are pretty close and are certainly on Ukraine speaking with the same voice, I think the Japanese feel that they need, for their own security, to show that they're willing to help Ukraine and at the same time send a message to China that they're not frightened of the two countries on their border.
What do you think that we can expect to hear from the G7 summit about Ukraine?
Well, I think the important thing is that the leaders of the Western nations, the G7, have decided to provide a long-term loan for Ukraine of about $50 billion, which is quite a lot of money. And this loan, the collateral, will be the interest on Russian assets that are frozen in the West. It means that if, of course, the Russians are allowed to reclaim their money, if the war ends in some way, then the European nations and America and Canada and Japan, which have agreed to this loan, will have to actually fork out the collateral themselves. But for the moment, this is coming from the frozen Russian assets. And this gives Ukraine immediate relief. They need the money straight away, and it's promised that they will get it before December.
This isn't a straightforward process, isn't it? It's got a lot of technicalities to it. How soon do you think we can see this being enacted?
Well, we've had the outlines of it drawn up by what they call the Sherpas, the people who prepare the summit, and it's up to the leaders of the nations involved to agree the details. And, well, I think they've agreed the principles, but the details of how the actual finance will be worked out and who's responsible for what and how the loan will be paid over and all that sort of thing, that I think we'll have to wait and see how it's drawn up. As you say, it is a fairly complicated sort of deal, and they haven't done this before. It's not a straight gift from all the nations involved. It's technically a loan, but it comes with the assurance that the West will do as much as they can to help Ukraine. And I think Rishi Sunak for Britain has already just announced a further tranche of aid directly for Ukraine.
And I wanted to pick you up on that because the UK Prime Minister, he's set to announce around 250 million to rebuild Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Do you think that this is the right priority to divide the money to?
Well, Ukraine needs all the help it can get for almost everything. I mean, the crucial difficulty at the moment is the Russian bombing and targeting of their energy infrastructure, which means that they've only got about half the power they had before all this started. And the targeting of the generating stations and particularly the large power plants is causing crippling damage. What Ukraine wants to do is to have enough money to set up little micro generating areas so that the Russians have many more targets and can't just knock out the whole system with a few well-directed bombs. And of course, that needs money to get it going, to set it up. But generally, money for the infrastructure is absolutely vital, although it's hard to know where to begin. I mean, so much has been destroyed in many of Ukraine's big cities that whether you start with the industry that's been hit or the communications or the networks, power and water and all that sort of thing, or whether you start rehousing people and trying to build houses that are temporary or indeed patch up the ones that have been hit. That's up to the Ukrainians to decide where their priorities lie.
What about in terms of weapons, those sort of supplies, ammunition? Do you think we can expect to hear any more on that from the G7 summit?
Well, I think that's been dealt with already elsewhere. I mean, that's been dealt with mostly through NATO and through bilateral announcements. The Americans, some few weeks ago, finally released the money they had promised, $61 billion, and that is nearly all for weapons. But what the Ukrainians need urgently is actual ammunition. They need the bullets. They need also air defenses. They need whatever they can get to stop the Russian advance in the northeast around the city of Kharkiv, where they seem to be pushing hard and where they're striking at the buildings more or less without any Ukrainian opposition, because Ukraine lacks the anti-missile attack weapons. They're getting some. They've got some in place, but they need many more. and they are pretty vulnerable to aerial bombardment, either by missiles or by drones.
A big criticism of the US aid package to Ukraine was that this was coming too late. How do you think that this G7 summit potential decision about these frozen assets could be received by Ukraine? Is it again going to be too late for Ukraine?
It's difficult to say. I mean, Ukraine needs everything now. It is really in a difficult position. The Russians are steadily building up their forces. They've learnt some good tactics. They've learnt how to coordinate their attacks, how to use drones, how to be effective in their attacks and follow them up. And the Ukrainians are feeling the pressure all along the vast front that is now separating the two armies. The Ukrainians could do with weapons and money straight away. Now, inevitably, it takes some time to get everything shipped over there, particularly things like tanks and ammunition, guns, and whatever. The Americans have promised to speed up deliveries. The Europeans are also delivering stuff. But the problem is that many of the countries that were able to deliver arms and weapons and necessary things for fighting the war, they have been taken off the shelves already. Whatever the Europeans had spare in their magazines and arsenals has already been given to Ukraine. So now the Europeans, and presumably also the Americans too, they actually need to start manufacturing more stuff to send over to Ukraine. And that takes quite a long time. I mean, if they haven't got it immediately to hand, then it will be a bit slower. So I think the Ukrainians need whatever is still available straight away.
Three of the G7 leaders, Sunak, Biden, Macron, they're all facing general elections this year. How do you think that these election results could impact, for example, the frozen assets plan?
Well, not very much, actually. Well, certainly not in the case of Britain, and probably also not in the case of France. With the Americans, it's hard to tell because nobody quite knows what Trump's plans are if he wins, and it is looking increasingly as though he has the lead at the moment in the opinion polls. If he wins, he's made it pretty clear that he's not going to give blanket support to Ukraine. He said he'll end the war within days. I mean, if that means he's just going to say to the Russians, go ahead, do what you want, we're not part of this, then indeed the war would be over pretty quickly, but it would mean simply a Russian victory, and that's the end of it. It may not come to that, but I think he will be looking pretty askance at this whole idea because he feels that America's money is not for spending on foreign adventures or supporting other places, other countries, far away across the sea in Europe. And I think that may mean that the American support, which is, of course, vital, as America by far the richest and largest of the G7 countries, that may be less forthcoming. Now, for the others, I think a Labour government in Britain would more or less stick with the plan. They've already said that they will support Ukraine and they'll do what's needed. And if Macron is defeated in Parliament, he still remains president. So the French elections, even if Macron's party loses heavily to the right-wing National Rally, nevertheless, I think as president, Macron can still insist that money continues or aid continues to Ukraine.
So it's also expected at this G7 summit that Zelensky will be signing new security deals with Japan and the US. What does that entail?
Well, Japan's an interesting one because they've really not been very involved in the Ukraine thing at all. They are far away. They are, in fact, a next-door neighbour of Russia. People forget that actually Japan has a border, although a sea border, with the Russians. And so they're pretty close by, but it is far away from Moscow and a very long way from Ukraine. The Japan borders Russia in the Far East. So they are quite wary of what's going on in Russia. They've been watching Russia for many, many years and feeling a little bit insecure living so near next to them. But I think the Japanese are very eager to show that they're part of the general Western alliance. And their immediate concern is obviously more China and the threat from China. But since China and Russia are pretty close and are certainly on Ukraine speaking with the same voice, I think the Japanese feel that they need, for their own security, to show that they're willing to help Ukraine and at the same time send a message to China that they're not frightened of the two countries on their border.
Do you see this G7 summit creating any reaction from Putin we've heard Russian officials saying that the idea of taking interest from Russian frozen assets, it's theft.
Well, of course, the Russians will be extremely angry, and they will threaten to do the same. I mean, they've already threatened and probably have confiscated most Russian assets, most Western assets in Russia. And I think if ever this thing comes to an end, it's going to be a very tough job for both sides to sort out who gets what back again. I mean, they seem to have lost, and it looks as though the Russian money, will be spent. So it's unlikely that the Russians will ever get it back, which are they pretty angry about. Yes, they'll make further threats. They'll say there are other things we can do to hurt the Western economies. They'll try all sorts of possible things, both political and economic. They're not in a terribly strong position, though, to influence what happens in the Western economies. They can threaten and have threatened, and in fact have been interfering in elections in the West. So they'll probably try to clandestinely support those parties that are more pro-Russian. Funnily enough, it tends to be on the far right where the support for Russia is greatest. So you may see a lot of interference, but I don't think it will amount to very much. Certainly not in Britain. That won't make much difference. Whether it will have any influence on the French vote remains to be seen. And of course, particularly whether Russia is going to do what they can to try in some undercover way to assist Trump to come back to the presidency.
And finally, what do you think we can expect to hear about China at the G7 summit?
Not very much. I mean, the Europeans and the Americans have a slightly different view on China. The Americans do see it as a strategic threat. They see China as the big competition for global dominance, and they believe that China, for all its economic power, is actually trying to undermine Western economic interests. Now, the Europeans, they do recognize that China is being very assertive, particularly in its own area. On the other hand, China is an important trading partner for Western Europe and for other countries. I mean, Japan will raise concerns about security threats from China, but the Europeans are not really very willing to brand China as a threat at the moment. Britain and Japan are both involved in this new kind of prototype Eastern NATO, what they call AUKUS, United States and Britain and Australia have set up a kind of alliance to provide nuclear technology for Australian submarines. And Japan is likely to be associated with that, though not part of it. And that does look as though that these countries, all of which are members of the G7, not Australia, but these countries are putting their minds together about how they can contain China. But I don't think we'll see any particularly hostile remarks over China. I mean, that would be somewhat divisive at the moment.
We're hearing claims that potentially Russia and China's relationship is turning sour. It's not as limitless as they once claimed it to be. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's inevitable that the Chinese are getting a bit tired of the amount of support that the Russians are demanding from them. Not simply political support, they're happy to give that because that discomforts the West, and that is also in China's interest. It rather threatens American hegemony, global hegemony, which the Chinese see as the main thing that they believe is unfair and wrong, and they're out to challenge it. But the Russians are pretty demanding in terms of what they want in vital supplies. They are very much the junior partner now. Okay, the Chinese are doing well buying Russian oil at cheap prices, which is in their interests. But it's quite a long way to bring the oil to China. They're not going to get huge amounts straight away. They've got new pipelines to build and that kind of thing. And I think the Chinese are rather worried that this fighting in Ukraine could escalate to the point where you've got a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. That is worrying for them in two reasons. If it turns nuclear, which the Chinese have said very outspokenly, that must not happen. They've warned the Russians, both publicly and privately, do not attempt to use nuclear weapons in this thing, because they know that would be terrible. That's the end of everything, really. And also, China is worried about secondary Western sanctions on their industries and products. If the West says that that China is supplying the Russians to help in their war effort and imposes secondary sanctions on Chinese goods, then the Chinese are losing valuable markets in the West at a time when their own economy is struggling a bit.
Michael Binyon, thank you very much.
Thank you.